Director for the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome. Today we have a very interesting session for you. The limits of judicialization from progress to backlash in Latin American politics. Three co-authors, Sandra Botero, Daniel Brinks, and Ezequiel González-Ocantos, who co-authored Working in New Political Spaces, the Checkered History of Latin American Judicialization. We'll have a charla moderated by Raúl Sánchez Rivera. And I will not take any more of your time. At the end for students, we have a QR code that we will show briefly before the session ends. Raúl?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And I say good morning from the 5 o'clock morning in Melbourne, Australia. And I can tell you, it's the beginning of a new day here, but also as we were talking about right before starting this panel, it's also the beginning for new functions, new roles, it seems, for judiciaries and courts across the region, new threats, emerging themes that until recently research had not explored in detail, mostly documenting a trend that is actually quite worrying sometimes, the backlash against judiciaries that we see in different places across the region. Just before we had a chat, I was reading about the latest news from El Salvador, the latest case out of many countries where there have been open interventions against court systems and quite often personalized or targeted on specific judges, for example. And that hasn't been an isolated case. We know of other countries as well that have gone through similar processes. But sometimes those backlashes are not necessarily as visible or conspicuous. And sometimes they're more subtle. Sometimes they tend to escape the eye. And that is precisely one of the challenges, but also one of the new possibilities for judicial research in the time to come. And we are in the presence of a very, very interesting, potentially groundbreaking seminal book in the field of Latin American judicial politics, a book that takes stock or seeks to take stock of where we are with judicial research in the region. An exercise, as we've seen, for example, with similar, when I was reading the introduction, I remember immediately of other books that have attempted to do that come out every few years and help us situate ourselves precisely in the maze of these questions and debates. For example, Helmke and Rios Figueroa's excellent edited volume that I think was published probably right now 8 or 10 years ago. And back then, it was really good documentation of how the story was going with respect to the promises and potential pitfalls of courts. And now we are 10 years later revisiting to some degree this question as well. With this introduction in mind, my name is Raúl Sánchez Rivera. I am hosting 3 excellent scholars in the field of judicial politics in Latin America, and I would say, and beyond, and the study of institutions more generally. And we have with us our friend Sandra Botero from Universidad del Rosario in Colombia. Hola, Sandra. Hello. It's so good to have you here.
Hola, Raúl. Buenas noches para todos y para todas. Thank you so much for the invitation.
No, the pleasure is ours. We have Ezequiel González-Ocantos. Joining us, Ezequiel, are you at Oxford at the moment?
No, I happen to be in Paris at the moment, but yeah, I'm in Europe. Yeah.
You're in Europe. Exactly. Well, welcome as well, Ezequiel. I think it's the first time that we have you here with us. And Dan Brinks. Dan, I think you are. Are you in Austin at the moment?
Sorry, yes, I'm calling in from Texas, from Austin, Texas.
Yes. So this has been a very interesting exercise that I think that you've been doing for the past few years, gathering a variety of visions that truly from the very beginning, you set it out as a truly interdisciplinary approach to the study of courts. But before we get to talk about the book, I wanted to hear a bit from you about your own story with respect to studying judicial politics. And knowing the works of all three of you, you have some interests in common, but also your own experiences, your own takes that attracted you about the study that attracted you to the study of courts, to the side of Latin American judicial politics. And I wanted to hear a bit from you about that, about your own journeys and how you got here, how the three of you got together from your own journeys to develop this volume. And I'm going to start in the arbitrary order of my Zoom interface. Sandra.
So the arbitrary order makes me go first.
Exactly.
So how did I end up here? I will try to be brief, but my undergrad is in history. So I went over to the dark side for my graduate studies. And when I decided to do my graduate studies in political science then I came across these topics. I took a class that was really fascinating to me, and it was actually a class taught by Dan Brinks that sort of changed the way I thought about many of these issues. But many of you who are here probably have heard about the history of the Colombian Constitutional Court, etc. And so when I started studying comparatively these questions of law and politics, and for someone who comes from Colombia, this is a very interesting field, one that raises a lot of questions, because we've sort of been used for good or bad to this really wonderful, but also hard to understand institution. So I think my interest comes from the reality of my country and trying to understand that better. And I had the wonderful luck of going to grad school with Ezequiel. And actually, we came up with the idea of this book because of something that he wrote in the acknowledgements of his dissertation, where he said that he hoped that one day we would be able to work on a project together. And then one day I called him and we have to do this. And the three of us had been having discussions, because these are the topics that interest us, about how do we think about what has happened with judicialization? And then this is how we ended up in this edited volume and inviting all these wonderful people along for the ride.
No, thank you, Sandra. I mean, one of the things that we found out in Charlemos over and over in these conversations is exactly the story behind the story, right? I mean, how we got here. And by the way, we also use the opportunity to talk to and to showcase to PhD students or early career researchers, how it's done in the process, which is something that we figure out as that famous character in Venezuela says, Omar Santos, is often a como vayamos yendo, vamos viendo exercise, right? And how we become familiar with research, not only by reading, but by doing. By meeting other colleagues along the way. Ezequiel, I'm going to jump to you, because after what Sandra said, Dan seems to be a pivot here with his class too, and I want to see what's going on in terms of how those conversations began emerging in the classroom as well. Ezequiel.
Thank you. I think what is interesting is that if you look at the stuff the three of us have written before, they tend to be quite optimistic, right? In terms of the potential of the judiciary to do things, to change politics for the better in Latin America, right? The idea that courts can, enforce social rights, that they can actually have an impact in sort of structural sort of policies, that they can sort of prosecute and try the perpetrators of human rights violations. So our work is optimistic in the sense that, and in a way, it sort of shares the optimism of the broader field of judicial politics, which was born out of this observation that courts are now much more important than they were in the past, changing things in Latin America as Latin America democratized. So this book, this edited collection, is sort of an anomaly, because it is a rather pessimistic book in many ways, and it sort of goes against a lot of the things that the three of us have said in the past, or that have talked about among ourselves in the past. In fact, this idea of como vayamos viendo, vamos haciendo, what you were saying earlier, that saying is pretty much, is very accurate in terms of describing how this book came about. Because when we organized this conference in 2019 in Colombia to talk about the state of the art in the field of judicial politics in Latin America, we never expected the conference to be so gloomy and so pessimistic in so many ways. And so we came out of the room on the last day thinking, well, boy, we have a very different project in our hands than the one we thought we would have when we started this. Because of course our priors were, as ever, optimistic. So yeah, I think sums up a little bit the story behind this book.
Now, it's interesting, Ezequiel, is and that's a juncture that seems very clear in your book as well. You know, it's very well illustrated. The idea that, well, there is a backdrop story that was very optimistic until recently, and that's how it was rehearsed in research, but also in the way in the key themes and topics that we talk about in class and we were bringing up. I think that also goes in connection with the story of democracy and democratization in Latin America for a few years. If we look beyond courts, or we look at courts as an instance of what's been happening with institutions, I think that moment of reckoning is indeed happening and has been happening for a few years. And of course, I'm saying this also as you well known, as someone who is Venezuelan and who does research on Venezuela, which from the very beginning was, for a few years already, hasn't been a story of optimism, but actually quite the opposite. And having said that, you're absolutely right. There are some themes emerging and that emerged from that conference that I can see in the book now. For example, concerns about judicial corruption, the limits of state capacity. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes, but Dan, would you like to chip in terms of how the project emerged, and in the Zoom arbitrary window, you're right in the middle between the two?
Well, I mean, the first thing is just a small personal note. I mean, there is almost nothing in academic life as great as collaborating with two excellent academics who were once your students and who are now colleagues and who are making incredibly important contributions in their own right. And so that's one thing, right, that this project means for me. Working with Ezequiel and with Sandra has been always great. I mean, it was great when they were students and it's great now, but it's really wonderful to be able to kind of interact on this project as equals and to sort of throw ideas around, right, with now a wealth of experience on each of our parts coming from different trajectories and different places, right? So that's one thing that I think if you get the chance to do it, by all means, you should try it. But I want to play a little bit with this optimism, pessimism theme that Ezequiel raised, right? I mean, it's true that the field as a whole, there were always people who raised flags, right? There were always skeptics or people who said, you know, this isn't really about equality, or this isn't really about increasing social justice for everyone, or greater inclusion or anything. But I think in general, right, when you talk to the practitioners, when you talk to people in the field, they did feel like this was a new opportunity, right? A new way to do politics that might permit people to advance projects that were really important and that had always been stymied by, you know, political exclusion, social marginalization, and economic inequality. And that's, I guess, as an aside, the reason why I got into this field to begin with, right? I mean, I was born in Argentina. I was in high school during the dictatorship. I then moved to the US, and it seemed to me that one of the most important things about living in a democracy was the extent to which sort of rights and laws structured your everyday interactions with the state, with each other, right? And so it was never kind of enough for me to study democracy from the perspective of sort of voting and elections and that sort of thing, right? I wanted to see what was happening in between. And as a lawyer who had actually practiced for a while, I wanted to see what it was that these legal actors were doing to contribute to creating a new democratic reality. And along with the optimism of people in NGOs and Supreme Court justices and so on, right, you also often saw the pessimism of people in favelas or shantytowns or wherever who said, you know, things still aren't changing, right? And that's sort of the story that came home to us when we did the event at Universidad Rosario. It suddenly became apparent that people were frustrated with the pace of change, or people were seeing reversals, backlash. I mean, you see, I mean, in your own country, Raul, you know, a sort of reversal of fortunes for democracy as a whole and for courts in particular. So that's kind of that's where we ended up after the conference. And what we're hoping to do with this book is to sort of try to get at some of the root causes of that malaise, of that failure to get where we thought we were going.
No, thank you so much, Ben. I mean, as you were identifying in your rehearsal of how the book came to shape, I was taking note of a few themes that I tell you, when I listen to the three of you, it's like listening to your introduction, but coming to life in our eyes in the conversation, right? I mean, is this challenge on one hand to the notion of, well, courts are the assumption that, okay, courts are good for democracy, but they in reckoning with this charge of elitism. They are elite institutions, and all of this is happening this is progress that is happening in the books, but not necessarily in practice. And on the other hand, as you mentioned, the frustrations with the lack of effectiveness sometimes, or quote unquote, well, to what degree the hope is actually hollow, you know, to quote that old book, The Hollow Hope. So bearing that in mind, if I can hear from three of you, and you can choose how to sort out your order here as co-authors, what is let's take stock. So what are, for example, after this collective exercise, what are some of the strengths, for example, that we see from judiciaries as right protections institutions in the region? What is still standing despite the circumstances?
I can start. Okay, Ezequiel, do you want to go?
No, go.
Okay, so if we're going to focus on the positives, and then I think this is something where we pick up in the book, where we start in the book, right? Is we talk like we have this whole structure in place, right? So one thing that all of the efforts of judicializations have left us with is a superstructure, what we call a superstructure, right? An institutional and cultural structure up top. That includes a very ambitious international law framework, that includes a set of very ambitious institutions in the different countries that were supposed to change things, and that in many instances they have, right? So I think we have immense progress in areas, for example, of trying to make effective indigenous rights, or recognizing legal pluralism, recognizing indigenous rights in several Latin American countries. I think we also have progress in terms of giving tools for other disadvantaged minorities to access legal processes, and also to access better access the political realm in general. I think this applies to, in many places, to women, for example, certain aspects of reproductive rights. I think it also applies to social and economic rights, depending on the configuration of the different countries. In some places, we see more environmental rights, like Argentina. In other places, the emphasis is placed elsewhere. So while the tone of the book is indeed somewhat pessimistic. I want to emphasize that we believe that a lot has been gained, not only in terms of the structure, but also in the sense that judicialization changed the politics of the region, right? It changed the way the discussions were made, and it gave different groups and many people who had not until then had access to these instances, tools to access, right? If for nothing else, also it actually improved the situation in terms of checks and balances in other countries, and that's nothing to sneer at. So I think those are some of the things that we can say where gains were made, and a lot of the literature, our work individually, as Ezequiel mentioned, and also a lot of the literature has tried to focus on that, on gains in terms of those areas.
No, and it's interesting, and I'm listening to you, Sandra. It's actually true. And one of the things that the changes that we've seen is that, and positive changes, is political scientists are talking more about courts and including them more generally in their assessment of how democracy works across or of democratic backsliding across the region. But also, on the other hand, the lawyers talk more about politics. And in law schools and legal research, there is a greater concern for understanding the way law works in a socio-political context. And that's a reflection of the changes you're pointing out. Ezequiel, you wanted to jump in and say something in relation to Sandra's points?
Yeah, just to build up on what Sandra was saying, it's important to note that the critique we make of judicialization in the book is not the critique that you often read about, which is sort of twofold. On the one hand, that courts are counter-majoritarian institutions and therefore they have a built-in democratic deficit. For us, that's not relevant, at least in the context of the book, in part because courts now have a clear place in the constitutional order of all of these countries, and therefore whatever they do, they have a legal basis for doing, so to speak, right? And the second sort of line of attack that you often hear is, well, courts are hollow hopes. Nothing good comes out of judicialization. And as Sandra was saying, clearly that's not the case. And in the field of Latin American judicial politics, there's lots of books, lots of articles that show precisely the ways in which courts can change things for the better. So those are not our lines of attack. Our lines of if you want, our observations are more sociological than sort of normative in nature. So on the one hand, we're saying, you know what? Yes, you've empowered courts to make these big policy decisions, but then states are weak and cannot enforce them. Or you expect these courts to do all these things like investigate complex crimes and whatnot, and yet you don't give them the basic resources to carry out fairly basic forensic tests, for example. Or you expect courts to change social mores and things like that, and yet you don't build social coalitions around big important policy choices that courts are making, and therefore when they make them, they face instant backlash that can be highly problematic. And then there's another set of circumstances in which you empower the courts, they perform very well, they do exactly what they're meant to be doing, for example, investigating grand corruption, as we're seeing lately in many Latin American countries. And there's lots of unintended consequences from this empowerment that were not in the mindset of those who said, okay, let's design courts in a way that they bolster accountability, both horizontal and vertical in these fledgling democracies.
So yeah, can I pitch in here? Because for me, in a way, that this last issue that Ezequiel is pointing to, when courts and prosecutors do exactly what we wanted them to do, in a way, I say we, although this was, at different times, the agenda of very different political movements. But, when they do exactly what you, in theory, ask them to do, and yet you have all these unintended consequences. And I'm referring to Lavajato and all the prosecution investigations that have sort of roiled the politics of the whole region, right? We couldn't have a book taking stock of the judicialization of politics without talking about that one issue. And that's a hard one to evaluate in a way, right? Because it I think at the conference, we were sort of torn between the people who said, no, it's an abuse of the legal system, or it's not what they were designed to do, or somehow this is wrong itself, right? And people who said, no, actually, this is what they're supposed to be doing. It's just the reaction to it that's wrong, right? Or the, the downstream consequences that are problematic, right? But when you take aim at an entire political class, as the prosecutors did in Brazil, and there's no underpinning, right, that can support that, it just, I think it tore the fabric of that democratic politics to shreds, and it's still creating negative consequences today, right? We're still living with the implications of that. So that was, for us, I think, a hard question to get our heads around, right? How do you evaluate a system that is more or less doing what it's supposed to be doing, but in a context in which the cure is almost worse than the disease?
And that's very interesting that you're pointing out to the normative challenges, to how it's questioning our assumptions of what courts should do and in what circumstances. And you point out in the introduction some of those challenges as well that are making us rethink the role of courts. And then you've pointed out one of them, the investigations of grand corruption scandals, and in the case of Brazil, also the potential challenges and problems that can emerge in that context. And you talk about others as well. You mentioned, for example, corruption, lack of state capacity. Can you elaborate a bit more into some of those problems that we're witnessing as well? And notice how we went from the extremes naturally to the weaknesses or to the negatives that we are able to now see emerging in different countries as well. And we can go in the reverse order if you like this time.
Sure, that gives me the easy job, and then everybody else has to come up with harder things to say, but that's fine. So I really want to highlight Santiago Asaves Serrano's chapter on the Ecuadorian court. I don't know that I've ever seen in the literature a chapter that is like this. It's incredibly good sort of field work. Well, I mean, he's from there, he's in that context. And he tells a story that is just amazing about sort of the extent of corruption and the purchase of votes within the Constitutional Court in Ecuador, right? And so that chapter raises the obvious question: is what were you thinking when you asked these institutions to do these big jobs without first checking to see whether they were, up to the task? And that's I think, one of the failures. Maybe it's not a new observation. I mean, I remember when, the World Bank or USAID were investing millions of dollars in judicial reform in Fujimori's Peru. And, it should have been more or less obvious to people that maybe that money shouldn't be spent right then and right there. But, I think there are a few chapters in the book that says, look, maybe we should think more carefully about the sequence in which we adopt these reforms, in which we adopt these changes, right? What's foundational, and how do you structure the changes so that you're actually building on a firm foundation as you go?
And as you're mentioning, the implications for judicial reform as well, which was another big topic back in time in agendas. We were very suspicious about where it was going to go. Well, now we can see where it's actually heading for. Very excited, by the way, to read Santiago's article in Ecuador. I'm a big fan of his work. I think it's done wonders also to help understand the informal dynamics of how judiciaries operate. And building on that, Ezequiel, Sandra, would you like to add up to what Dan pointed out?
So the book covers a lot of very different topics in terms of where we sort of explore from different angles. The authors explore from different angles the failures or the limits or the problems with judicialization. The chapters on judicial nepotism by Julia Rios and judicial corruption by Santiago Basabe are fantastic because I think they cover a topic that as scholars of judicial politics we have really not touched upon much, which is what happens when there's corruption within the courts and the courts, have institutional pathologies that make it impossible for them to do their job after being empowered by all these, lofty and grand reforms. But then there's other chapters that show something which is equally fascinating, which is this idea that judicialization is often, it's done through lawyers and through coarse lawyering, and it's often, handled by, professionalized NGOs and whatnot. And some of the chapters, in particular, one by Camila Gianella on Peru, shows the detachment that often exists between these very committed, sort of perhaps in many cases, very progressive professionals of the law that are trying to advance social causes in the way they know how to, which is by litigating. But then they fail to sort of build up or to root those sort of causes in broader social movements or in broader coalitions. And that is often sort of the original sin that the victories that they achieve in court carry throughout their lives, because then those victories stand on very feeble grounds, they're easily challenged, when on the other side you have much more organized movements trying, for example, to challenge abortion rights in the courts. That is the subject of her chapter, Camila's chapter on abortion rights in Peru. So again, chapters like that show that often litigating can be successful, litigation can be very successful, strategic litigation can be very successful. But if you don't sort of articulate broader coalitions, then the outcome of that can be quite fragile.
Absolutely, Ezequiel. And as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking back to what Sandra pointed out at the start of the conversation, how on one hand, one of the key aspirations of having strong judiciaries across the region was the protection of social rights, and how that's creating different types of avenues in different countries for different types of rights. I wonder what's building on what you're commenting and now thinking ahead in terms of what works for purposes of reform or for purposes of improving how judiciaries work in their context. Where should our attention be placed in terms of, should it be, for example, to support legal support networks? Should it be to establish greater connections between litigants, lawyers, NGOs, you name it, and the social, political context in which they are embedded? Sandra, would you like to comment on those different aspects? Of course, take that question or comment whatever way you see.
Wherever I want to, thank you. So I can think of a number of things there, actually. So clearly, I think that the set of chapters that discuss this detachment between the cause lawyering or the very sophisticated strategic litigation and the social roots would suggest that definitely we need to do work there, right? That we need to build broader societal basis for these changes that were being advocated for. So clearly that's one thing. Then I think another interesting thing about the book is that there's a couple of chapters that also look beyond the highest courts and look in other places. So for example, the chapter on Mexico, which was written by Janice Gallagher and Jorge Contese, because they're focusing on more mid-level judicial operators, prosecutors, etc. So I think there is a lot of work to be done at that level too, right? Both in terms of the research that we need to also focus on those mid-levels and low-levels judicial operatives, but also in terms of reform there. Because if we want these judicial institutions to give us the ambitious outcomes we are demanding from them, then they, at a most basic level, need the tools to do so. So I think that's another area where we need to think about. But then to me, something that it's also going to be a matter of great attention in the next couple of years is also this issue of backlash, right? And some of the chapters in the book think about backlash not only in terms of societal backlash to these controversial decisions, although that's the case, but also in terms of the bureaucracies, right? Like the little ways in which certain actors can actually chip away at some of these decisions. For example, Laura Bernal's chapter looking at what empresarios, help me out
Business
here, the word.
people. Yeah.
Business people, thank you. Oh my God, my English is failing me. At what business people do to actually stall accountability for human rights crimes in the Colombian context. So to me, I think the reforms that we most urgently need are the little ones that generate the tools for things to stick here. Like I don't think we need we no longer need like the big reforms that give us these courts, but we need the things to stick at the lower levels, if that makes any sense.
Can I have a two-finger on that?
Thank you, and thank you so much, Sandra. Just one quick second, Dan, because I want to announce out loud. I was just writing in the panel that we are engaged in a really interesting conversation on courts, and we're welcoming your questions. Please feel free to ask questions we thought that we could reach you in the chat box, but of course we can reach you in the Q&A, or you can reach us in the Q&A as well. So please feel free to ask your questions directly in the Q&A. Dan, sorry that I interrupted you. You wanted to jump in.
That's fine. I would love to hear questions from the audience too. So no, what I was thinking then is that very often, I think because this research has to do with the kinds of issues that we care about normatively, right? Like the perfectioning democracy, I guess, if you will, greater inclusion, rights for various marginalized groups, and so on, right? There are times in which we sort of jump to your question very quickly. We say, well, what can we do to make things better? What can we change? And what's the institutional fix for the problem we see? And I think one of the lessons from the book is that, the fix may not be an institutional one, or at least in the short run, it may not be an institutional one, right? That there's often absolutely no substitute for the kind of laborious process of social change that is required to anchor institutional changes in a wide base of popular support, right? So we sometimes, I remember doing field work in different countries or whatever, talking to NGOs who always had this educational kind of mission that was parallel to their litigation mission or whatever, right? So they would print up pamphlets, know your rights, and they would hold little seminars in neighborhoods and whatnot, right? And I always thought that was the sort of froth on the substance, that was the bubbly stuff that like maybe didn't matter that much when you could actually go to court and get what you wanted. But I'm not so sure about that anymore. I think that's hard, but I think that in a lot of cases it's not, and we're not talking about a quick institutional fix.
Yes, Ezequiel.
And I think there's an interesting dilemma here because, let's take two examples. One is, in the book we have cases in which courts have done or said certain things that triggered backlash, right? Both in terms of affirming rights, but also in terms of, prosecuting corrupt politicians. And you could say, well, maybe they shouldn't, because, why not just build first these broader coalitions before we ask the courts to affirm those rights? So perhaps it's not necessary for the courts to intervene. Or why not sort of, plan this more comprehensive overhauls of the public administration so that corruption is weeded out before we start prosecuting people. in order to avoid the courts, soaking and poking and causing backlash, which can be counterproductive. And that's fine. But on the other hand, if you've got a politician who steals, of course the court, if it's going to affirm the rule of law, has to intervene, right? If the victim of a violation feels that they've been aggrieved, that their rights have not been respected, of course they're going to go to court because it's something very personal to them, even if that case will lead to a big structural decision that the court then issues and causes backlash. So there's a dilemma here between, asking courts perhaps to moderate and not intervene and try to be more, try to exercise some self-restraint, and the very, very demands of the rule of law, which is that they have to intervene when there is a violation, when there is a crime, and so on and so forth. So it's a very difficult sort of balancing act here between avoiding the pitfalls of judicialization, in this case, backlash, and on the other one, enhancing the very foundations of the Republican system of government, which requires the courts to do their job, And so it's a difficult situation.
Ezequiel, by listening to balancing, reminds me of Diana Kaviseski's book on tactical balancing. We have two questions from the audience, and I want to jump to the questions in the audience. They're now coming up. Time is passing by quickly before we notice. So I'm going to go in the order of the questions. We have first Will Freeman. Hi all, thanks for this fascinating discussion. Do you have thoughts on how countries in the region can most effectively clean up corruption within the judiciary and prosecutors' offices? What specific internal reforms could judiciaries pursue? And one of the things that I like about Will's question right away, and you've brought up a few times already, is our need also to move our gaze from courts and then move them analytically and systematically on the different institutions and actors that interact with courts as well. So building on Will's question, would like to jump first.
The most obvious answer to that question, at least what comes out of, for example, Santiago's chapter, and he documents a protection pact between hegemonic presidents and Supreme Court constitutional court judges, whereby they provide political favors and political support, and then the president lets them do what they want in terms of extracting bribes from litigants, right? And that is sort of the source of grand corruption at the level of basically there, the key solution is to pluralize political power so that those protection pacts cannot exist and prevail. So that's sort of the structural solution, I suppose, to the problem. As with many things, democracy and pluralism can bring some good unintended consequences. As with the other forms of corruption, like the one that Julio documents in his chapter, nepotism, or in our chapter on the Peruvian lavajato, we talk about networks of judicial clientelism that make the investigation of corruption harder. There, it's very difficult. Sometimes the prosecutors themselves sort of combat that form of corruption within their own ranks. But it's difficult to think, well, what can sort of reduce the incentives for this to happen?
No, and as you mentioned, right? I mean, the need for documenting different types of corruption and different kinds of schemes and the way that they tend to operate. As I listen to your comment, I think of the old joke that a lawyer from my hometown once told me about judicial corruption in my hometown. And he said, look, I mean, we say here that there are 3 levels of judicial corruption. I say, what do you mean? Well, we call it the 1, the 1-2, or the 1-2-3. I said, what do you mean? Well, 1 gets you to the lower court, 1-2 gets you to the Court of Appeal, and the 1-2-3 gets you all the way to the Supreme Court. And we know very well how much is each. It's like the building and the lift. But I'm going to jump then from the dynamics of judicial corruption to now the question, of course, of analysis. And I think that corruption is a really good one for those purposes. Rang's question goes along those lines. Interesting project published under the auspices of our Cambridge University Press series on comparative constitutional law and policy, which, by the way, is a great series. For those of you not familiar with it, go check out the titles. A really, really good series. For me, there is a bit of analytical fuzziness here between the role of courts, how potent courts in the region, the whole of hope discussion are, etc., and the concept of judicialization, which implies something slightly different, namely the transformation of non-judicial issues, sometimes blatantly political ones, into the judicial ones with the concomitant assumption that courts ought to deal with such issues. And I think that Rand's question brings us back to the beginning of to two issues at least that I would love to hear from you on. One is, well, what is really the advantages of judicialization? What is really what we're trying to look at in the past that had very strong assumptions about perhaps horizontal accountability at salient cases level. Our conversation is already showing that that shouldn't be the only way that we look at the question of judicialization or our own auspices. But also, once again, the question of normative assumptions. So any comment about Rand's question?
I have one if you want, I'm sure my co-authors do as well. So thanks, Ron. I think that is a really good question. And in fact, we did struggle with it a little bit, right? I mean, because the question for us was, if we're going to take stock, I mean, we need to have some sort of measuring stick. We need to have some way of saying compared to what, or, what were we expecting to get and what did we get? What's the measure by which we evaluate this thing? So in the end, we settled on something that is hopefully not too fuzzy conceptually. And that is, we think of judicialization as a political project, right? It didn't just happen. It was a political project that came about through a pretty serious investment by a lot of people into building what we call the superstructure, right? Into creating new rights and creating new courts that have the capacity, on paper at least, to enforce those rights, and bringing in international human rights law into domestic constitutional law and so on, right? And along with that, what we talk about in the book, which comes really out of an earlier book on sort of the culture of legality that has emerged in Latin America, which is this concomitant or parallel transformation of legal culture in the region, in which lawyers and high court judges and others kind of understand that this is part of their function, that they're meant to enforce these very ambitious rights that are built into constitutional texts, and that courts are legitimized to intervene in all these really big debates of public policy and social marginalization and all that, right? And so if that's the political project, right, if it didn't just happen, but somebody built it to do something, then what was it that they were trying to do, right? And in the introduction, we really kind of settle on not so much the achievement of some utopic ideal as the end goal, but rather the construction of these alternative political spaces where people can go and present their demands on the state, or present their demands against each other, for that matter, right? And the creation of a new politics that's more inclusive, that's more open to these demands from previously marginalized peoples, that includes sort of on the obligatory public agenda, the demands for social and economic rights, and so on, right? And including the stuff that Ezequiel writes about on sort of accountability for past human rights violations and all that. So then the question for us isn't really, normatively, is that a terrible choice for these countries, or should they have had a better understanding of the separation of powers or something, right? But rather, okay, what happened? Where are we now after 20 years of this, right? And with the goal primarily of examining what's happening in those political spaces that were newly constructed, right? So what's happening if we understand the judicialization project as a political project that's meant to bring more people into these conversations, including judges and lawyers, but also including, say, indigenous peoples, right? So what happened in those spaces? And that's what kind of we look at. Sometimes we find that those spaces got too far ahead of their societies. Sometimes we find that the demands that come out of those spaces are too heavy for the states to bear. And sometimes we find, right, that the spaces themselves are corrupted. And so they're not going to produce anything positive, right? So 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 that's kind of I think that's the conceptual framework.
If Sandra or Ezequiel want to add up.
And in a sense, the concept of judicialization that we're dealing with is slightly broader than that, in the sense that it's not just policy questions being transposed or taken from the legislature to the courts, but it's also questions that are legal in nature that ought to be dealt with by the courts, like, for example, the prosecution of corruption crimes, or the violation of clearly established rights. So what happens when the courts finally get there, when they're judicialized, when these cases, which ought to have been in the courts for a long time, but now finally make it to the courts? What are the societal reactions to that? What are the institutional reactions to that?
No, thank you, Ezequiel. And listening to you, it seems that this is as we go in this exercise of taking stock of the research. I had a very interesting conversation earlier this week with a student who's just starting her PhD project, and she hasn't reached. It's one of those that when she began talking about courts, she talked in a very enthusiastic way. She's very very keen to do research in courts, but she hasn't pinned down her project yet. No, she's at that moment that we all know, where they know that we've been there before. And she asked me, well, what do you think? Why should I prepare myself in terms of the pitfalls, for example, for doing research? She was interested in particular in corruption at the lower court level. Yeah. And I found it fascinating. I thought, no, this is so cool, because it's not only we're moving away from the Supreme Court, because we're moving away from the dynamics that we've already studied, and we are already seeing students being interested in those areas. So, and at the same time, I said, look, I mean, there's this tension between desirability and feasibility, right? That we go back to in terms of how we can study those a phenomenon like that. But there are many like those that challenge that are really hard to design in terms of research design, but also to carry out in terms of actual practical research. In your book, there seems to be an emphasis on document, and on a lot of the information comes bottom up from scholars who are familiar, who are embedded in their own socio-political contexts. Can you comment a bit of that? I think that indirectly I'm getting at the question of methodology as well, and of data collection and those kind of things. We're moving away but it seems from some of the big end projects we can do from afar to some of the more embedded projects that require field work and a more challenging tool and skill set. Any comment in that respect?
Oh, I will start. I think one of the very interesting things about the book is that there's a mix of different methodological approaches to these topics, right? So we have everything from, let's go again to Santiago Basabe's chapter on Ecuador, right? Which, if you're going to study corruption like this at this level, if you want to understand the mechanisms and the practices, you need to interview and talk to these people and get really close to them. So one of the fascinating things really about Santiago's chapter is like the stories that he tells you and the things that he found out. No, really, it's just like, please read it because the thing is mind-blowing. So there's that kind of work, right, that requires, and we specifically sought out people who were, yes, who had deep knowledge of these cases. But then there's also, we have a chapter also by Sofia Forero Alba and Juan Carlos Rodriguez Raga, for example, thinking about how the legitimacy of the Colombian Constitutional Court is built by using a survey experiment, right, with this new like methodological technique, trying to think about how the different arguments, the way that the court builds the argument affects or influences the way people evaluate the court and the decision, right? So in the book, you'll find a little bit of everything. And while I personally I am eternally grateful and think that it's super important that people continue doing field work and writing from the places that they know well and that they know deeply. I think there's also certain phenomena that we can approach using well these other types of tools. So we also have a chapter that looks, for example, at discourse analysis around Lava Jato in Brazil as well. And I think that's also interesting. So my sense, I mean, my words of wisdom to your student, if she's thinking about corruption things, is that I hope she tackles it and that she should definitely prepare herself from some fascinating conversations here in Latin America with the legal operators. And also, by the way, for whatever that's worth, it seems to me that that is an area where we urgently need more research. So I, for one, would vote for her doing that dissertation, if that's the case.
That's what I told her too. I agree. Ezequiel, Dan, would you like to chip in as well, or?
Sure. I've been wanting to say something from the beginning about our contributors, because the three of us are here. We wrote the introduction, but like we've already mentioned, right? We walked into this thinking one thing, we came out thinking something really different. And I think increasingly there's room for collaborative projects, right? I think there's so much to learn from each other and so much to learn from people who are actually a part of the politics of the places that they're writing about. Many of the people listed in the book are either live in Latin America and are actively participating in the kinds of politics that they're writing about, or are from there, or spend lots of time there, right? That, as Sandra was saying, there's no substitute for actually knowing the place that you're writing about. But then again, increasingly we have ever more sophisticated techniques, ever more sophisticated ways of apprehending reality and getting to know what's happening in a different place. And you can't know everything. Certainly I can't know everything, maybe you can, but working with someone who does really good experimental work, and somebody who does really good econometric work, and somebody who's deeply embedded in a political system like Santiago Asabe, and working with someone and bringing all those things together in a kind of coherent project. I think that's an underappreciated tool. I think you don't often find the mini conference and edited volume in a chapter on qualitative or quantitative research, but I think it should be there.
And relatedly, I think it's one of the other things about this volume is that we often talk about interdisciplinarity, and this is the big aspiration, and there's funding for these sorts of things. Deans want you to be interdisciplinary and that sort of thing. But often when you get to these edited collections, they're all political scientists, or it's not the case with our book. Our book has, lawyers who take on, for example, Lava Jato is very different from the political scientists take on Lava Jato. There's sociologists. There's obviously political scientists, but there's political scientists of different sort of methodological and epistemological persuasions. So I think in many ways that's what makes the book, I think, hopefully appealing to a broader audience, which is that it speaks in different languages, but it talks about the same things. And I think that sort of enriches the discussion.
No, absolutely, Ezequiel. I'm gonna change tracks quickly to a question that we got from Scott in the chat box, and here's his question. And he can't use the Q&A, so he went to the chat box and asked, in terms of backlash and the possibility that the medicine is worse than the disease, what about the long run? Dan suggested that there is not always an institutional fix. And how does a country then attain better behavior? Is it possible that the awful medicine leads to better long behavior? And that's a question of well, I think it's a question also of the stock taking mechanism of when are we assessing institutional design, and when can we draw conclusions that actually institutional design works or not, or whether it's longer run that we can actually make those analyses. But I'll take this question as an invitation as well.
Yes.
I suspect it depends on the kind of policy that elites or whoever is lashing back, against. So, and the kind of learning that happens as a result of that backlash, right? So, of course, if the outcome of the backlash is the complete dismantling of the democratic system, then of course, perhaps there's a lot to be discussed about whether or not it was wise to sort of push in certain directions to begin with. But sometimes backlash can learn you to do politics better. So if your conclusion after backlash is that the problem was not the judicial decision or the empowering of the court or the pursuit of litigation in the first place, but actually the inability to, explain that decision better, to sell that decision better, to build coalitions around that decision better, then perhaps backlash, can be productive, because next time you'll do it differently. And there's also the possibility of learning, from one context to the next. I don't know, the Brazilian prosecutors learned from the Italian ones when it came to investigating corruption, and they did some things differently and some things better. Similarly, the Peruvians learned from their counterparts in Brazil, and again, they learned and they tried to find ways of preempting backlash when it came again to investigating high-profile elites for corruption. So if anything, backlash can be an opportunity to learn and do judicialization better if you want. But there's also cases in which backlash is so problematic because it goes at the core of the institutions that enable judicialization, and then you can learn whatever you want, but then those institutions are gone, and that's it.
Sandra, Teresa? Oh, okay. Yeah, I was going to say something very, very similar to what Ezequiel said. Well, in the first, and I'll keep it really short because I know we're running out of time, but one is, backlash, it depends on when you stop looking, right? I mean, there is always resistance, right? One of the points we make in the book is that there's no progress that comes without somebody being upset, right? And there's no progress that comes without a counter project, right? And that counter project may win or may not win, but there's always backlash of some sort, right? And in judicial, I think in the area of judicial politics, it's often been, people who were too quick to say, wow, you made a bad decision because all you did was make a bunch of people upset, right? Well, first of all, those people were getting what they wanted before the decision. They're only upset now because they're not getting what they wanted, or they're afraid they're not going to get what they wanted, right? And so often if you take a slightly longer period of time, right, and it's hard to know exactly when to stop looking, right? But if you take a longer time frame, you can find that backlash is a sort of this maybe dialectical move, right, where you have some sort of synthesis down the road, maybe. The other thing I would say is that you can sometimes win by losing, and this is sort of a short form of what Ezequiel was saying a moment ago, which is, I had this really interesting conversation with one of the justices on the Constitutional Court of South Africa, who made the decision. They made the decision in a case involving dialysis, and they denied access to this man of dialysis, and he died shortly thereafter. And what this justice said was that this provoked a widespread social conversation about whether the state was assigning enough resources to healthcare, and in particular to this kind of healthcare, right? And so the plaintiff died, right? Probably would put that in the lose column for the judiciary, or for the judicialization project, or for something, right? Surely that's not a positive outcome, no matter what you're thinking about. But on the other hand, right, the involvement of the courts in making such a high-profile decision can bring things onto the public agenda, so that at some point, right, if the courts are articulating the kind of public policies that our deepest commitments require, right, that can produce a more generalized conversation that takes us to a different place than we would have been if that same decision had been taken by some bureaucrat somewhere buried in the Ministry of Health, right? So I think there's a way in which backlash, and this I think is part of what Ezequiel was saying, is not always a bad thing, right? I mean, we shouldn't always get what we want. That's not democratic politics, right? But we should always have grounded conversations about the important things that really matter, right? And I think courts can help us do that sometimes, even when they fall short.
So if I can say something to close.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That's what I wanted, that I was expecting, Sandra. Thank you.
So to me, it's a cycle, right? And it's not in the sense that it's a circle and you're always returning to the same spot because it's like 2 steps but more like a spiral, right? Where you're hopefully like coming again to places that are familiar to where you've been before, right? But luckily you have different tools, have made other headways, other people are in the discussion, and you're no longer in the same plane. So I'm interested in the backlash discussion in the sense that understanding the way that who is mobilizing against what and what is being mobilized. I'm sorry for repeating that, but I think it's the first and what kind of resources are being mobilized helps us understand the discussion, but it's never exactly the same. So I'm interested in understanding the different layers and thinking about that, not so much as us going in circles, but it's a cycle where we're hopefully advancing, at least in terms of different levels.
And once again, as you mentioned, Sandra, very good that that history moves in those kind of cycles and spirals and way and back. And as much as we see to the future, because it's a stock-taking exercise, we have that already, that history behind us of reform and failures and pitfalls and opportunities, but also are able to see some of those events with the benefit of distance. Now, maybe when we're doing research 15 or 10 years ago, they were happening and we were in the process of getting it. Now, some of them have happened a few years ago. So we can see their effects in a different way, even talk to actors in a different way and have access to data that wasn't there before. Anyhow, then Sandra, Ezequiel, this has been fantastic. Once again, I strongly encourage everyone, the participants, to get a hand of this really interesting collective exercise. I, for that matter, look forward to reading the whole book. There will be I'm looking forward to the opportunity, and I'm pretty sure, pretty confident that it's going to be a very important book for the subfield and beyond, for the field of comparative judicial politics and the other fields that are connected to it, as we know. If you would like to say a final word to say farewell, and otherwise, well, I bring this to a close, but at the same time looking forward to seeing you in a future Charlemos, and also inviting everyone to the next Charlemos, which is going to be on Cuba. And we've left the title Cuba to speak for itself in terms of the very interesting dynamics that we're going to be looking at in the next Charlemos. We're going to be talking with our dear colleague Armando Chaguaceda, with Professora Silvia Pedraza, and our dear member of Charlemos, Javier Corrales, will be a moderator. And la charla será en español. The conversation will be in Spanish. So we look forward to it. It's in about a month, on the 25th of October, and at the same time, same place, as that old TV series Batman used to say. Same time, same place, same Charlemos will be here. Thank you so much for coming. And once again, Dan, Sandra, Ezequiel, thank you so much for joining us in Charlemos.